I stood in a $1,000 suit. I couldn't afford watching my girlfriend's parents judge every word that came out of my mouth, and realized that love sometimes asks you to become someone you're not. 3 months later, I would discover that pretending to be rich was the least complicated lie in our relationship. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, when I actually believed that wearing expensive clothes could make me worthy of a woman I loved more than my own pride. My name is Marcus, and I'm a 32-year-old high school teacher in Cleveland, Ohio. I make $48,000 a year, which is enough to live comfortably in a modest apartment and save a little each month. I drive a 2008 Honda Civic that runs perfectly fine despite the dent in the rear bumper. I shop at Target and cook most of my meals at home. My life isn't glamorous, but it's honest and stable. At least it was until I met Stephanie Chen at a mutual friend's wedding last spring. Stephanie worked in pharmaceutical sales and made nearly twice what I earned. She lived in a sleek downtown condo with floor-to-ceiling windows and wore designer clothes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. But none of that mattered to me. What mattered was the way she laughed at my terrible jokes and how she cried during the sad parts of movies we watched together. What mattered was that she texted me good morning every single day and fell asleep holding my hand. For 6 months, we existed in this perfect bubble where our different tax brackets didn't matter at all. Then she invited me to meet her parents. Stephanie had been nervous about it for weeks. She kept dropping hints that her parents were traditional and had certain expectations. I figured she meant they wanted her to date someone Chinese, which I understood even though I'm black. But the night before the dinner, she sat me down in my tiny apartment and told me the real problem. Her parents didn't just want her to date someone Chinese. They wanted her to date someone successful, someone wealthy. Someone who drove a BMW and wore a Rolex and summered in the Hamptons. Someone nothing like me. I told her it would be fine. I told her that parents always come around when they see how happy their daughter is. I told her that my credentials as a teacher and my plans to eventually get my master's degree would impress them. I was so naive. Stephanie looked at me with these sad, desperate eyes and asked me a question that should have made me walk away right then. She asked me to pretend to be something I wasn't. She had a whole plan worked out. I would tell her parents I was a private equity consultant. I would wear a suit she would buy for me from Nordstrom. I would borrow her coworker's Mercedes for the evening. I would mention fictional business trips to New York and San Francisco. I would talk about my investment portfolio and my stock options. I would become Marcus, the successful businessman, instead of Marcus, the underpaid teacher who genuinely loved their daughter. The reasonable part of my brain screamed at me to refuse. The reasonable part of my brain knew that starting a relationship with her parents based on lies was toxic and doomed. But the part of my brain that was desperately in love with Stephanie Chen whispered that maybe this was just temporary. Maybe once her parents got to know the real me, they wouldn't care about the money. Maybe love was worth one night of pretending. So I said yes. Stephanie took me shopping the next day at stores I had only walked past before. She picked out a charcoal gray suit that fit me perfectly and cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. She bought me Italian leather shoes and a silk tie and a watch that looked expensive but wasn't quite the real thing. When I looked at myself in the dressing room mirror, I barely recognized the man staring back. I looked successful. I looked wealthy. I looked like someone who belonged in Stephanie's world. I hated it. But I hated the thought of losing Stephanie more, so I played along. She coached me in the car on the way to her parents' house in the suburbs. She reminded me to talk about consulting projects and business meetings. She told me to compliment her mother's cooking and her father's taste in wine. She squeezed my hand and promised it would all be worth it. I wanted to believe her so badly that I ignored the knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach. The Chen house was exactly what I expected, beautiful and expensive and cold. Everything was white or cream or pale gray. The furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. There were fresh flowers in crystal vases on every surface. Even the air smelled expensive, like some kind of imported candle. Stephanie's mother, Helen, opened the door wearing pearls and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her father, Richard, stood behind her in a cashmere sweater, looking at me like I was a business proposal he was already planning to reject. Dinner was excruciating. I sat at their dining room table eating food I couldn't pronounce and lying through my teeth about a life I didn't live. Richard asked me about my work, and I fed him buzzwords about market analysis and portfolio optimization that I had memorized from Stephanie's coaching. Helen asked where I lived, and I gave them the address of a luxury building downtown that Stephanie had picked out. They asked about my family, and I told them sanitized versions of the truth. My father worked in logistics instead of drove a delivery truck. My mother was in education instead of cleaned houses to put me through college. With every lie, I felt myself shrinking. With every fake smile, I felt the real Marcus disappearing. But Stephanie looked so relieved every time her parents nodded approvingly that I kept going. I drank wine I couldn't afford to buy and laughed at Richard's boring business stories and complimented Helen's interior decorating. I played the role perfectly. By the end of the night, I could tell they were warming to me. Richard shook my hand firmly at the door and said we should play golf sometime. Helen hugged Stephanie and whispered something that made her smile. In the car on the way home, Stephanie was euphoric. She kept saying I was amazing and that her parents loved me. She said the hard part was over and now we could just be ourselves. I wanted to ask her when exactly we would reveal the truth, but I was too exhausted from the performance to start that conversation. So I just nodded and held her hand and tried to ignore the sick feeling in my gut. That should have been the end of it. One dinner, one night of pretending, but of course it wasn't. Richard invited me to his country club the following weekend. Helen wanted Stephanie and me to join them for brunch. They started including me in family events and asking about my fictional business deals. Every interaction required more lies. I had to research private equity firms and memorize stock market trends. I had to borrow them or seds again and again. Stephanie kept buying me expensive clothes and accessories to maintain the illusion. The watch became a problem because Richard noticed it wasn't a real Rolex, so Stephanie got me a better fake. The worst part was how normal it started to feel. After a few weeks, I could slip into my wealthy businessman persona without even thinking about it. I knew which wines to order and which restaurants to suggest. I could talk about market trends and investment strategies with enough confidence to fool people who should have known better. I became so good at being fake Marcus that real Marcus started to feel like the pretender. If you're invested in what happens next, please hit that like button and subscribe. It means the world to me and helps me share more stories like this. Now back to what happened. My breaking point came 3 months into the charade. Richard offered me a job at his investment firm. He pulled me aside at a family dinner and told me he was impressed with my business acumen and wanted me on his team. The starting salary was $160,000, more than 3 times what I made teaching, enough money to actually become the person I was pretending to be. I should have been thrilled. I should have seen it as a way out of the lie, but all I felt was trapped, because I didn't know anything about investment banking, because I would be exposed as a fraud within a week, because accepting the job meant burying real Marcus forever. I told Richard I needed time to think about it and spent the next 3 days having a quiet breakdown in my apartment. Stephanie didn't understand why I was upset. She kept saying this was perfect and that I could just learn on the job. She suggested I take some online courses or read some books. She actually believed I could fake my way through a career in finance the same way I had faked my way through a few dinners. She didn't see that we had crossed a line from temporary pretending into permanent deception. Or maybe she saw it and didn't care. That's when I started to realize something I had been avoiding. Stephanie wasn't uncomfortable with the lies because Stephanie had been lying too. She had been lying to herself about what she wanted. She said she loved me for who I was, but she had never introduced the real me to her parents. She said money didn't matter, but she couldn't imagine a future where I stayed a teacher. She wanted me to be both things: the genuine man she fell in love with and the successful businessman her parents approved of. She wanted me to be impossible. I told her I couldn't take the job. I told her we needed to come clean to her parents about who I really was. I said if their love was real, then a little honesty wouldn't destroy it. Stephanie looked at me like I had suggested we burn her parents' house down. She said I was being dramatic and that we had come too far to turn back now. She said her parents would never accept me as a teacher and that I was choosing pride over our relationship. Maybe I was, but I was also choosing sanity. I was choosing to stop drowning in a role that suffocated me every single day. I was choosing to be the man my own parents raised me to be instead of the man someone else's parents wanted me to become. I told Stephanie that if she couldn't love me as I actually was, then we didn't have a real relationship anyway. She cried, I cried. We both said things we didn't mean and some things we absolutely did mean. In the end, she asked me to leave and I did. I walked out of her beautiful condo in my jeans and t-shirt, leaving behind the expensive suit and the fake watch and the person I had been pretending to be. I drove home in my dented Honda and felt more like myself than I had in months. The next morning, Richard called me. Apparently, Stephanie had told her parents everything in some dramatic confession the night before. He was angry. He called me a liar and a con artist. He said I had wasted their time and disrespected their family. I let him yell because he wasn't wrong about the lying part. But when he paused for breath, I finally said what I should have said 3 months earlier. I told him I was sorry for lying, but that I had done it because I loved his daughter. I told him I was a high school teacher who made an honest living helping kids learn. I told him my father drove a truck and my mother cleaned houses, and they were the best people I knew. I told him that money didn't make someone worthy of love, and that his daughter deserved someone who loved her enough to be honest even when it was hard. Then I told him that person probably wasn't me anymore, because the lies had poisoned what we had. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I didn't expect. He said he had grown up poor in Taiwan and worked his way through school and built his business from nothing. He said he had wanted better for Stephanie, which is why he pushed her towards successful men. But he also said that somewhere along the way he had forgotten that character mattered more than bank accounts. He said he wished I had been honest from the beginning because he might have respected me for it. Might have, not would have, but it was something. Stephanie called me a week later. She apologized for putting me in that impossible position. She said she had been thinking about what I said and realized I was right. She had been lying to herself about what she wanted. She loved me, but she also loved the lifestyle her parents' expectations promised. She wasn't ready to give that up. She wasn't ready to defend me to them or to choose a smaller life with a teacher over a bigger life with a banker. She said maybe someday she would be brave enough for that, but not today. I appreciated her honesty even though it hurt. We agreed to go our separate ways, no more pretending, no more lies, just two people who loved each other but wanted incompatible things. It wasn't dramatic or angry, it was just sad in that quiet way that endings often are. The months after were strange. I had to process not just losing Stephanie but also losing this alternate version of myself. The businessman Marcus had felt powerful and confident in ways that teacher Marcus sometimes didn't. There was a seductive appeal to being someone who could walk into expensive restaurants and country clubs without feeling out of place. Part of me missed that even though I knew it was hollow. But I also rediscovered things I had forgotten while I was pretending. I remembered why I became a teacher in the first place, because I loved seeing kids understand something they had struggled with, because I believed education could change lives the way it had changed mine, because making $48,000 to do meaningful work was worth more than making twice that to do something empty. I had let Stephanie's world make me feel small, but I wasn't small. I was just different. I started dating again eventually, nothing serious at first, just coffee dates and casual dinners with women who knew exactly what I did for a living. It felt liberating to say I was a teacher without shame or asterisks, to talk about my students and my small apartment and my old car, to be fully myself from the very first conversation. Most of the dates went nowhere, but that was okay. I wasn't in a hurry anymore. Then I met Jennifer. She was a nurse at the elementary school where I taught. She drove a car older than mine and lived with two roommates to save money. She packed her lunch every day and cut coupons and wore scrubs to work instead of designer clothes. She was beautiful and funny and kind. And when I told her on our first date that I was a teacher making less than $50,000 a year, she said that sounded like honest work and asked me what I loved about it. That's when I knew I was going to be okay. Jennifer and I have been together for 8 months now. We go to free concerts in the park and cook dinner together and talk about our days. She's never asked me to pretend to be anything other than who I am. Her parents are working-class people who welcomed me into their home and didn't care what kind of car I drove. There's no performance required. No expensive suits or borrowed cars or carefully rehearsed lies. Just two people building something real together. I think about Stephanie sometimes. I wonder if she found her successful businessman. I wonder if she's happy or if she's still trying to be two incompatible versions of herself. I hope she figured it out. I hope she learned what I learned, that you can't build a real life on a fake foundation, that love requires honesty even when honesty is uncomfortable, that being enough for someone means being yourself completely. The experience taught me things I needed to learn. It taught me that my worth isn't determined by my salary or my zip code or the brand of watch I wear. It taught me that the right person won't ask me to be someone else to earn their family's approval. It taught me that small, honest lives are worth more than big, fraudulent ones. It taught me that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are exactly the same. I still teach high school English. I still drive my old Honda. I still shop at Target and cook at home and live modestly. But I don't feel small anymore. I feel like exactly who I'm supposed to be. And that's worth more than any amount of money or approval from people who never really knew me. If I could go back and do it differently, I would have walked away the moment Stephanie asked me to lie. I would have told her that if her parents couldn't accept the real me, then they weren't people I wanted in my life anyway. I would have saved us both months of pretending and the painful unraveling that followed. But I also know that sometimes we need to make mistakes to learn who we really are. The suit is still hanging in my closet. I haven't worn it since that last dinner with the Chens. Sometimes I look at it and remember the person I pretended to be, the confident businessman who said the right things and impressed the right people and slowly disappeared under the weight of his own lies. Then I close the closet door and go back to my real life, my small, honest, beautiful real life. Because at the end of the day, we all have to decide what we're willing to compromise to be loved. And I decided that the one thing I couldn't compromise was myself. Not for Stephanie, not for her parents, not for anyone. That decision cost me a relationship I valued, but it gave me back something more important. My integrity, my authenticity, my sense of who I am when nobody is watching. That's the thing they don't tell you about pretending to be someone else. The costume eventually becomes uncomfortable. The lines become harder to remember. The real you keeps trying to surface, and eventually you have to choose. You can keep performing and lose yourself completely, or you can take off the mask and risk losing everything else. I chose myself. It was the hardest and best decision I ever made. So here I am, 32 years old. High school teacher, drives a beat-up Honda, dates a nurse who thinks I'm enough exactly as I am. Some people might look at my life and see failure. They might see someone who couldn't rise to meet expectations. Someone who couldn't fake it till he made it. Someone who chose small when he could have reached for big. But I look at my life and see freedom. Freedom from pretending, freedom from lies, freedom from trying to be worthy of people who measured worth in dollar signs. I see a man who knows exactly who he is and refuses to apologize for it. And that man sleeps better at night than businessman Marcus ever did. The Chens probably tell the story differently. I'm probably the con artist who fooled them for 3 months, the loser teacher who wasn't good enough for their daughter, the one who got away and good riddance, and that's okay. They're entitled to their version. I know my truth. I know I fell in love with someone who asked me to be impossible. I know I tried and failed and learned. I know I walked away when I finally understood that love shouldn't require you to disappear. Jennifer knows the whole story. I told her everything on our 3rd date because I promised myself I would never start another relationship with secrets. She listened carefully and then said something I'll never forget. She said that people who really love you don't ask you to audition for the role. They cast you as yourself because that's the only person they want. She was right, that's what real love looks like, not expensive dinners and borrowed cars and carefully maintained illusions, but honest conversations and shared values and acceptance of who someone actually is. Stephanie loved an idea of me. Jennifer loves the reality. The difference is everything. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I think about the job Richard offered me. I think about the money and the status and the life I could have had if I had just kept lying. If I had taken the job and faked my way through it long enough to learn. If I had become businessman Marcus permanently and buried teacher Marcus in an expensive suit. Would I be happier? Would I be more successful? Would I have ended up with Stephanie? Maybe, but I also would have lost myself completely. I would have spent every day waiting to be exposed as a fraud. I would have built a life on quicksand that could collapse at any moment. I would have looked in the mirror and seen a stranger. That kind of success isn't success at all. It's just an expensive prison. So I chose differently. I chose the small apartment and the modest car and the work that matters. I chose authenticity over approval. I chose being fully myself over being partially acceptable. And every single day I'm grateful I made that choice even though it cost me someone I loved. Because the person I am now can actually be loved completely. The person I am now doesn't have to maintain a false identity or remember which lies I told to whom. The person I am now can introduce girlfriends to his parents without coaching them on what to say. The person I am now is free in ways that businessman Marcus never was. That's my story. The time I pretended to be rich to win over my girlfriend's parents and discovered that some performances aren't worth giving. The time I learned that being good enough means being honestly yourself, not perfectly someone else. The time I chose integrity over approval and found out that I could live with myself better than I could live with lies. If you're reading this and facing a similar choice, I hope you choose yourself too. I hope you find someone who loves you without edits or conditions. I hope you build a life that feels true even if it doesn't look impressive. Because at the end of the day, the only person you have to face in the mirror is yourself. And that person deserves to recognize who's staring back.